Hello, I'm Ben Gibson, part-time mountain safety advisor for Mountaineering Scotland. And I thought I would just like to take you through a little slideshow on mountain features and some of the features you're going to see on a map whenever you're using it to navigate around the mountains. Um, so a map is a 2D representation of the land, and trying to be able to get a understanding of what that map is telling you um, can be quite challenging. So having an ability to interpret contours and a 2D image into reality is a really good way of developing your skills of navigating in the mountains. So there's many features that you're likely to come across on various maps, um, and this list here is just an example of some of the things you're going to find whenever you're out on the hills. And I thought I would just take an example of some of them just to help you get your eye into how they would look from the map to real life. So we're going to take a few of them and just help you sort of start to develop that understanding of how contours actually match reality and match the land around you whenever you're out in the mountains. So let's start off with something pretty straightforward and easy, and that is a valley. And a valley will be described as a low point between two higher points in the mountain. So we've got here in the Cairngorm mountain range, we've got a very popular, well-known valley called the Larry Grue, which is this uh, dotted line through here. This is just a track that's running through. So that is the lowest point here. And then you can see on these steep slopes here, we've got a higher point, which is indicated by this 1083 spot height. So that's 1083 meters. And then just off of the corner of the map, just down here, we've got another higher point. And all this ground is sloping away downhill to the lowest point, which is the Larry Grue here. Now, to build that up into a 3D image can be quite challenging. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like in reality. So we can see here in this slide, this is a 3D image of the Larry Grue. In the previous slide, it was a map image, using the contours in a 2D format. So we can see this is a 3D format. Here's the Larry Grue, which is this very low point, and you can see that track running all the way through and off around the corner. And then you have your higher ground all up here, all these high points here, and then all this steep ground is starting to fall away into the valley. And it has a very U-shape to it. So you can have various types of valleys, either U-shape or V-shape, depending on whether or not it's a water-shaped valley that's been eroded through water or glaciated valley. Some other features to bear in mind and look out for whenever you're roaming around the mountains and navigating is rivers, streams, and burn lines. And the good thing about the maps is that they can all be indicated and given or shown what they look like by the thickness of the blue line, which indicates water. So you can see here where I'm marking, there's a very skinny blue line here and here, and there's a few others over here. So they're all quite skinny single blue lines. Imagine you're just using a pen to draw a blue line, and that would be a burn line, something that starts off in the high mountains. And as we progress our way down the hill, you can see maybe some of these blue lines are starting to get a little bit thicker. So maybe here, for example, these sections, and there's one here actually as well, weaving its way down. So that could be a stream getting a little bit thicker, indicating something that's going to be wider as well. And then further on down, once these are all kind of joining together and increasing the scale and the size, you get your rivers, which are these double blue lines here. And that's because all this water is flowing out down the mountains and increasing in size as it joins onto other streams, then forming the rivers and then into something big like a loch or heading on out to sea. Just to give you a close-up view, you can see here you've got your burn lines, these single lines, then starting to flow into these thicker blue lines, and then into your double blue lines, which are your rivers here. So something to bear in mind whenever you're walking in the mountains is whenever you're planning a journey and you're looking at the weather forecast, and you might think if it's potentially raining a few days before you plan to go out that weekend, or even during that day that you're out, depending where you are, those burn lines can fill up quite quickly and might be really challenging, if not impossible, to cross if you do come across one and you have to get your way across. So it's worth bearing in mind whenever you're out planning your journey. If you know you're going to be crossing lots of streams or rivers, looking for locations where there is a bridge or somewhere safe and appropriate to cross that is a calm, straight section that's not very fast flowing, that might be manageable to cross, that's not deep, feeling that you might have to venture your way slightly further upstream to find where it becomes less and less and smaller into a burn line that might be easier to cross. So just something to bear in mind whenever you're looking at maps and trying to navigate your way safely across rivers and streams and burns in the mountains. So just to give you a real life example of burn lines flowing into a stream, this is on Ben Nevis. This was after a short burst of heavy rain. These burn lines filled up very quickly, and it's quite steep ground, so they're going to flow downhill very, very rapidly and then start to flow into this stream, which you can see actually is really quite full with water and could be really challenging to cross. So it's worth bearing in mind, like I said previous, looking at the forecast and how much rain there is going to be a couple of days before or even during the day that you're out on the mountains. So you can see here in this image, the stream to the left here doesn't look too bad at the minute because it's probably been quite dry, the last period of this picture here. But you can see just on the edge of the grass here, the bank where the stream can get quite high and full and almost turn into a river. And something to bear in mind is the width of it as well. If you did have to cross this, at the minute, it looks quite dry and manageable and shallow, but if you had a sudden burst of rain a couple of days before you headed out on your journey, this would be, impossible to cross if you needed to cross. So again, just worth bearing that in mind. So some other features that we need to be mindful of and look at how to interpret a 2D image into reality are ridge lines and areas of ground that's steep and narrow. So again, here's another very famous ridge line. This is the Anakeagak ridge line in Glencoe. You can see it heads its way up through here on this dotted line. And it's very narrow in places and quite challenging. So looking at that, it might be hard to tell which way is up, which way is down. But thankfully, we've got other features which can indicate, the height. We can use the elevation numbers and the contour lines. That will give us a big clue as to what's high and what's low. We've got a big obvious road here running down at the bottom. But if you didn't have any of these features in the map and you couldn't really tell, a good clue is to look at the burn lines and the streams. They always flow downhill. So when water flows downhill, they're going to the lowest point from the highest point on the contours. So that's another good indicator as to where up and down is on a map if you didn't have any other of these clues to let you know what the contours are doing. So just zooming in to get a closer look at this ridge line, you can see these contour lines, which are the thicker brown lines known as index contours. They're getting quite bunched up together here in and amongst the other contours. And you can see there's very narrow between the drop going down this side and going down this side. So whenever those contours are getting very close and very narrow, and then sudden steep drops on either side, it starts to form, a narrowing or a ridge line of some sort. So just to put that into a real life image of what the previous 2D image of the map was showing, this is our ridge line of the Anakigak here running along, really quite narrow. And then if you can imagine, if contours actually existed on the land, they would be running along here 10 meters apart at those 10-meter intervals, kind of indicating really steep ground, and they'd be following in and out of all the little nooks and crannies here. So that's how the contours would look if you were to imagine if they existed on the ground, and then being steep, running all the way downhill. So that's our ridge line, and you can see it continuing on further on in the distance to the Munro over there. Some other features to be mindful of are gullies, which are what I would call a terrain trap, especially in the summer. They're just a funnel for debris and rock and things to just fall down into, and are probably best avoided in the summer. On occasion, they may be an approach line up to a mountain somewhere, but there's always alternatives to get to Munro. So bear in mind that gully lines can be a dangerous place to be in. So looking at this mountain here, this is Ben A. We've got a gully line. It's a little bit hard to see, but what's happening with the contour lines is they're coming around and cutting back into the land and back out again. So there's like this little U shape forming in here, and that's giving an indication of a steep gully line. And just to look in reality, you can see this gully line here. It's this huge, big, deep gash in the mountain here. So the contour lines, if you imagine, would be running in, cutting back in, and then coming back out again, following the shape of the land. So these contours are kind of doing this and back out all the way up through there, indicating that gully. And like I said, they're a place to avoid in the summer because they're just very loose, rocky, and hazardous. In the winter, they may be potentially better if there's more snow, but again, that can bring other problems such as avalanche hazards. So be mindful and be careful of thinking about traveling up through gullies. Cliffs, crags, and outcrops are very dangerous and hazardous, but can also be useful whenever you're navigating in poor visibility. So cliffs, crags, and outcrops are indicated by these kind of broken black lines that run across the edges of very, very steep ground in and amongst very steep or close together contours. And you can see here that there are also little outcrops and crags, these little kind of black lumps and squiggles, again sort of dotted around the place all over here. So this is indicating very dangerous steep ground that you would definitely want to avoid and not be in and amongst anywhere there. But they can be useful to use as a navigational aid where you're hand railing the edge of it in poor visibility. So if you were coming up this slope, you could be using it as a guide on your left hand side as you're walking, making sure that it's constantly there on your left hand side and know to avoid it. So a little useful way to navigate using steep edges and drops, but being mindful to not be right on top of it, just be away from it, and still be able to see it. And again, just to show you how that steep cliff and those outcrops look in real life, this is Craigmeggy, and these are these very, very steep cliffs here. You can see, that's the top up there, and you could use that as a handrail as you navigated your way across and improve visibility, but you certainly wouldn't want to be making your way down any of this steep ground or get caught down here because it is very, very hazardous. So again, it's worth bearing that in mind in your planning whenever you're heading out into the mountains about where these hazards might be and how best to avoid them whenever you're planning a walk. So depending on where you are in the UK and what location you're in on the map, you'll have places of a low point between two high points, and that can be referred to as a col or a saddle, but in Scotland we call it a bealach, which is a pass or kind of a way through somewhere. And you can see here there's a Bealach here between Selig and this Munro top somewhere just up in here. So this is the lowest point between these two high points, and it's also quite a narrow ridge line here as well. And again, you can get an indication as to where kind of the highest point and low points are by using the numbers that give indication to the altitude on the contours, and also the streams and rivers are starting to flow down from that point. So just spend that little bit of extra time looking for those clues on the map that tell you which is high and which is low, and you'll start to get a picture of what the mountains are looking like using the contours more and more. So just to give you a closer picture of what the previous slide was showing, you can see here there's a complete contour here, a little circle that's forming like a little kind of spot height or high area, and then you've got your actual highest point here, and you've got a good clue which is indicated by the high point number there, the altitude. And then hopefully by now you'll start to get an understanding of kind of which way is down and what the contours are telling you. So this is from a high point making its way down through the contour lines to a very low area, and then it's starting to make its way back up again to this high point, as you can see with the numbers here going up from 700 to 800 and so on. So if you can start to build a picture of what the map is in your mind from a 2D image to reality, you'll start to get a better understanding of what the ground is and how to actually use a map, and feel more confident in your ability to navigate whenever you're out in the mountains, especially if the visibility isn't great. And here's just a quick 3D image of how a low point or Bealach would look. So you've got your high point up here and up here, and then it's coming down this steep slope to a very low area here before it starts to rise up the ridge line again. So that's your Bealach or low point or col or saddle, depending on where you are in the UK. So one of the biggest things to really be in tune with and mindful about is contour lines, and when they get closer together, which indicate steeper ground. Now, generally, if you look down here where I'm marking, you've got these two thicker index contours, and in between there are 4 other contour lines. And now that's a normal thing to see on the map. But whenever it starts to get closer and closer together between those 2 index contours, what happens sometimes is that the other contours can't be fitted in, so they have to get squeezed out. So you can see these contour lines are moving across here. This is kind of 4 in here, but all of a sudden, just in here, they're kind of missing. And then if you start to look around this map and spend a little bit more time investigating, you'll notice that there are other places where those contours are actually missing. And whenever that happens, as a rule of thumb, that's getting onto about a 30-degree slope, which is quite a steep slope and quite challenging ground to be up. Now, it's hard to know what that looks like just looking at a 2D image, but it's worth bearing in mind that 30 degrees can be a hazardous place to be, especially at the end of a day when coming downhill. You've got tired legs, maybe your brain switches off a little bit, and you end up having a wee slip or a trip. So just be mindful whenever you're planning your journey. Spend that little bit of extra time looking at the map and seeing where the track or your path or your route might take you through some of that steep ground, and just being mindful that it's there on the mountain. And then you need to think about how to potentially create an alternative journey that's maybe slightly safer if you don't feel comfortable in your own ability to maneuver through that ground. Just to give you a close-up zoom in view of the map, you can see these thicker index contours, and there's only 2 contours there. They're kind of a little bit disjointed and broken in here. They're not quite complete. So there's definitely steep areas in and amongst this place. Here it's not so bad. it's a little bit less steep, but you can still see there's a bit of a disjointed contour there before it joins onto here. So that is going to be steep, challenging ground. And if you note that this path actually takes you up through that. So again, just, plan ahead, spend that little bit of extra time in your planning whenever you're going out in the mountains to look and see what the ground is telling you. So just to put that into perspective, into a real life image, you can see that this slope running down here is quite steep. It's getting on to about 30 degrees, and you can look and you can see this person just standing at the top of that. Now, think about the consequences of a slip and a slide coming down through this type of terrain. So maybe this person is comfortable and happy being up there and are aware of the risks of what's below them, but you need to be careful and mindful in poor visibility that you don't accidentally stumble into terrain like this and then get caught out. That's where planning and spending that time looking at your map and looking to see where contours are potentially missing to help you plan ahead and potentially avoid those pitfalls and traps that you can get caught out in. So scree slopes are a common place and a common thing to have in the mountains, especially if you go to the Cuillin Ridge and you're wanting to venture out into some of the more technical Munros. You're going to be presented with scree slopes that you would have to navigate your way up and down. And these are indicated by these little kind of black dotted lines or black dotted features coming down the contours here and here. You can see on the map, and just over here as well. So that's giving an indication of lots of rock and debris just sitting, lying loose on steep slopes. So just looking at it at a different perspective, this is a 1 to 25,000 scale map, which gives a little bit more detail on how some of the scree actually looks. You've got these dotted marks all along the map here, which gives indication of all that scree, but it also gives you indication of how the scree is shaped and formed. You've got these kind of teardrop shapes that are forming downhill, and you would call that a fan, where it starts to fan out at the bottom. So it's starting from maybe from a single point, fanning out just down the fall line of the slope. So it's giving you a better picture of how much scree and where it is in the mountains. And also here you've got lots of rocky ground, all this kind of light grey here is giving lots of bigger boulders or bigger scree. That's probably a location that you don't want to end up in and be moving in and around. But like I said, some of the locations within the Cuillin Ridge, like the Great Stone Chute, it's a way up and a way down to get up onto one of the Munros there. But again, it's just being mindful about how to navigate that and who is in the same area as you. You certainly don't want to be beneath other people kicking stones down towards you. So it is really important to be very careful whenever you're venturing up into these areas. And here's just an example of one of those stone chutes or scree slopes within the Cuillin Ridge. You can see here this day out, these two people here have decided to wear helmets because they're heading up through somewhere that's a little bit more hazardous, but they're venturing up into maybe more technical climbing ground. And some of the size of these boulders are quite substantial that you certainly wouldn't want to dislodge and tumble down towards them. So again, be very careful and mindful of how you navigate your way through scree slopes. And just to give you another example, this is coming off the Anakiga Ridge back down to Glencoe. So they're just taking their time, very slow and steady, traveling their way down these scree slopes. They can be very loose, and if you just don't feel confident in your feet, they can feel that little bit more challenging. So certainly don't rush into venturing into this type of terrain. Just play it slow and steady, and once you feel you've got the confidence to maneuver yourself around the mountains, especially on more technical ground, you can start to plan journeys where you think if you're going across scree or up and down, that you're a bit more prepared for it. Finally, just to finish off with, looking at maps and looking at these features, it's always a good idea to use and play around with different scales and different types of maps, such as the Ordnance Survey OS maps or Harvey's maps. They will all show features in a slightly different way and maybe in either less detail or more detail. And if you can start to picture that detail in a different way using those different scales, you're going to become a better navigator and build up more confidence maneuvering yourself around the mountains. And especially when it comes to bad weather or if the weather turns against you, you can actually then interpret a 2D image to reality and just get yourself off the hill if you needed to whenever that visibility becomes reduced and you just need to get yourself down safely. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully this has been helpful to you, and good luck with your journey in successfully getting yourself up and down the mountains.